Now, when I was 17, I fell in with a bad gang of people. And when I say I fell in with a bad gang of people, I don't mean they did really nasty things. What I mean is they were really bad at being a gang. And I want to tell you a story about that night, or was one night with this gang, and what it means for how groups operate together. So one of the things this gang of people like to do was to vandalise things. So the way this would generally run out is we'd go out drinking. This is making me look really bad, but you'll get the point at the end. We'd go out drinking, and then on the way home, we would wait till there were no cars around, and then the gang would kind of vandalise something, typically street furniture, traffic bollards, and things like that, right? And once we'd had a kind of 2-minute orgy of violence and vandalism, then we'd run a little bit further down the road and then kind of relax and keep walking. And that's what young guys do, right? So, now, one particular night, we had just done one of these things. We destroyed a roundabout and all the traffic bollards. And we were walking a bit further down the road, and a police car rolled up next to us. And we were the only people in the area at 2 in the morning, right? And me and 2 of my gang members were on the right-hand side of the road, and there were a couple other gang members on the left-hand side of the road. And the policeman wound down his window, and he said, "Lads, do you know anything about that vandalism back there?" And what happened next was, to his eternal shame, my friend, who I'm going to call X, said, "It was them," pointing at the other 2 guys on the other side of the road, who promptly scarpered down a side street and hid behind a bush for 3 hours while the police searched for them with torches. And so this is when I was 17, and what I learned from that experience was that when it comes to groups of people, and when it comes to gangs, actually, the first thing I learned was about gangs. First of all, there's a reason why the mafia have a code of silence called the omerta. Right, so we didn't have that code of silence. In fact, we had no really rules in this gang. We had no plan B and no escape plan and stuff like that, so we weren't a very good gang. But from a people point of view, there was a lot of peer pressure going on in that group. And I say with my hand on my heart that I actually didn't get involved in that vandalism. I used to stand back. And I can't stick up my hand and say, look, I stopped them from doing it because I thought it was stupid. But I did stand there and go, that's a bit ridiculous, really. Why do you need to trash a bollard in the middle of the night? I don't know. But peer pressure is a very real thing. And I think in our teams, we have a responsibility to, when we spot bad behaviour, actually call it out. And the other thing, of course, I learned was that when the pressure gets on, sometimes teams do turn into individuals. And the it was them moment, passing the blame and protecting your own little patch, is something you also want to watch out for. So I went on from there to study psychology at uni and study social psychology and how groups work. And now then I spent had an 18-year holiday in advertising, and now I'm back into this area of kind of psychology and how teams operate. And I wanted to share with you some of the latest research about how teams work together and how it relates to delivering more high-performance teams for you, who I see as a crowd of emerging managers with 5 to 10 years experience, right? So, and the first thing I want to talk about is, before we start talking about teams, I want to give you a bit around motivation of individuals, because a lot of the questions that came through when you signed up for this said, how do I motivate people? And that is important to think about the individuals before you think about how they operate together. So, one of the things that I learned in my career is that leadership is what happens when you're not in the room, when you leave the room, right? So it's relatively easy to be the kind of leader who's hands-on, who's in the meetings telling people what to do. But actually what you need to be thinking about is, how do you create a culture and an environment and values in your team such that when you go on holiday for 2 weeks, you can have confidence and trust that decisions will still get made in the right way and that people deliver to the standards you expect. So leadership is about what happens when you're not in the room, and it's more about what your team does than what you do. The ideal team apparently has 7 members, plus or minus 2. So between 5 and 9 is an ideal number for a team. If you get more than 9, and some of you will have this situation, it starts getting a bit fractured because people aren't dependent on each other. And I remember one particular company I worked in where I had 2 teams reporting into me that had nothing whatsoever to do with each other. So 4 people in each team. And I tried to create one team from that because they reported into me. But it just didn't work because they had nothing to do with each other. So I think about the size of your team as well. If it gets too big, it doesn't work because there's no dependency. But I want to talk about these individuals because you do have people in the team with different points of view and different needs. And I want to talk about how you motivate them. And this guy, Dan Ariely, is one of the leading kind of founders of behavioral psychology, and he does lots of experiments around motivation. And one day he had a friend who worked for a big bank. And the guy had been writing a presentation for a big merger. And he'd taken 2 weeks to write this presentation, and at the last minute, the merger got cancelled. And the guy was really despondent. And so Dan airily said, right, how can I, this is really interesting that he did all his work, and he's really despondent because there was no result from it. So how can I make an experiment out of that? So what he did was he got Lego Bionicles, which is what that picture is up there. And he got people into his experimental lab, and he asked them to make Lego Bionicles. He said, I'll give you $3 if you put it together. And so they do that, $3, and he put on the table, there's your Lego Bionicle. And he said, will you do another one for $2.70? They say, yep, do another one, put it on the table. And he'd see how many they did, with the financial incentive decreasing slightly each time. And then he did another group of people where he got them to do exactly the same thing, but when they'd made the Bionicle, he'd say, thank you very much, take it apart and chuck it in a box. So that was what's called the meaningless condition, where they were making Bionicles for money, but it was completely meaningless. Whereas the other condition, where he was putting them on the table nicely, at least had some very slight meaning to it. And what did he find? Well, he found that the financial incentives were exactly the same, but in the meaningful group, who had this very small amount of meaning, they made, on average, 11 Bionicles, and the meaningless group made 7, which is a 57% increase in productivity just by attaching a very small amount of meaning to the task. And what we learned from that is actually that's a very small kind of artificial experiment that's probably hard to relate to in your jobs, but a wealth of research over the last 20 years shows that when it comes to financial incentives, they only really work for tasks which are repetitive, unchallenging, and highly controlled. And they don't work very well for jobs or roles which are self-directed, complex, and creative. So if you try and pay someone some money to make a piece of art at the extreme end, you actually get worse art if you pay people directly to do it. So, and what comes out of that for me is that, of course, in the 21st century, all our jobs are moving towards self-directed, creative, and complex. And very little of what the people in this room do is checking confirmations and routine and boring stuff, right? So we've got to think about a new paradigm of motivation. And one that I've used when I work with teams is up here. Daniel Pink is one of the kind of most famous proponents of this theory of motivation. And this is based on a lot of research. And he says motivation is about purpose, mastery, and autonomy. And I want to dive into particularly purpose, but a little bit on each of those. Mastery is a really simple one, which is that I want to know I'm getting better at what I do. And if you've ever been in that moment in your job where you feel stale and you're not learning, then mastery is one of the things you would have wanted in that position. And people want rapid feedback about how they're improving. So mastery is a really easy one. And I want to touch, though, a bit more on purpose as well, because why do we get out of bed every morning to come and do our jobs, beyond making money for some shareholders in some faraway company? And a guy called Simon Sinek has done a TED Talk and a book that many of you will have read called Start With Why. And he says that some of the most successful companies in the world in terms of the products they innovate, the staff satisfaction, they start with the why. Why should you bother coming to work today? What are we trying to do for the world? And then they do the how, so how are we going to deliver on that? And then they do the what do we actually make? But those companies, and Apple's a famous one apparently, but those companies are pretty rare. Most companies are what or how companies that just, we make fridges and TVs, and that's what we do. And it's not as motivating for people to get out of bed to come to work every day. And the example I'd like to give you that's relevant to us in the room today is there's one company, I think, in the Australia marketing landscape that has done the why particularly well. I'm not saying others haven't, but one that pops to mind is Naked. I don't know if there's anyone here from Naked today, but Naked, I know I saw Ian Perrin used to be at Naked here. Naked was founded in 2002 with a purpose, which was that they felt that having media planning and media buying together meant that agencies were directing money according to where their deals were, and it wasn't necessarily in the client's best interest. So they set out to say, well, we're going to challenge that. We're going to be completely transparent, decouple planning from buying, neutral, naked, transparent over here, right? So I think that was a really interesting area, and they were very successful as a result. They had a very clear brand. They've completely changed their position these days, but they had that why. But for you in the room today, most of you are one person managing a small or medium-sized team in one office in one country of a large multinational. So it's easy to start up a company with a purpose, like mine is to help the world make better decisions. But it's, you know, you might scratch your head about what do I do with my team that just works on Eubank or something, right? So I would say to you, there is something you can do about giving your team a purpose, which is you need to look back at the times when your team has been at its best. And you need to say, what were we doing? What were we delivering? Why did we have so much energy and passion in that moment? And that's where you're going to find your purpose. And a couple of thought starters for you around this in my time in advertising when I was thinking about this question were, clearly there's a client service purpose, delivering on clients' needs, beating their expectations and all that. That's a valuable purpose. There is also an effectiveness purpose, and how can we make our advertising really effective? That could be a purpose as well. And I think beyond that, the highest level you can get to around that is a sense of advertising makes the economy go round. It keeps us in jobs. We create demand. We keep that economic growth happening. So that is actually a worthwhile purpose. So what I'd say to you is think about, if you're leading a team, what is the purpose that you want to share with them? And I think it kind of comes from within you as a leader. It's not a kind of democratic process as much. You can take feedback, but what purpose, why do we get out of bed every day? So I think the why is really important for you as you motivate people. From an autonomy point of view, there is a company in Australia called Atlassian, and they run, they own a bit of software called Jira, which a lot of creative agencies and media owners use for project management. And what they do with their team is they have this thing called a FedEx Day, where once a quarter, 2 p.m. on a Thursday, everyone stops work, and for the next 24 hours, you work on any innovation project that could be of interest to you that has some benefit to the company. And it's called a FedEx Day because you have to deliver it overnight. So at 2 o'clock the next day, they all present back their ideas. They do this once a quarter. And that, in a sense, gives you a bit of autonomy and freedom to express your creative juices. And it's this kind of small version of Google's 20% time. If you know Google's 20% time, engineers get 1 day a week to work on whatever they want. So autonomy can be expressed in that way. It can also be expressed in terms of flexibility to work how I want to work, when I want to work. And one of the most extreme examples of this is something called a results-only work environment. And a number of companies in the States are pioneering this, and Gap is one of them, where you have no schedules, you don't have to be at work if you don't want to, you don't have to come to meetings unless they're relevant to you. All you have to do is deliver the results that you've signed up for. That's called a results-only work environment. And the research they're showing around that is that if you've got some of the other things in place, like a bit of a purpose, and people are motivated, then autonomy then further builds on that and increases productivity. So results-only work environment is another expression of autonomy. My recipe really for individual motivation, if I was going to try and summarize it in 7 minutes, what I've talked about so far, works a bit like this. I think the first thing you've got to do is pick the right people in your team. Sometimes you inherit them, but then you're going to be hiring new people. And in my experience, hiring is one of the things that media agencies, less so media owners, are really quite average at, to be honest. It's all about going for coffee. And if you recruit people over coffee, research shows in these unstructured interviews are basically only a little bit better than tossing a coin. You really don't get that much good information from it. But I'm not going to talk about that in any depth today, but hiring the right people is clearly an important skill. Then give them the why, help them get better at the skills and master their topics, and then get out of the way. Let them do what they do best. So that's kind of some thoughts around individual motivation. But sometimes you can have the right individuals, but when they put them together in a team, it doesn't work. And I want to talk for my second part of the speech around what happens when you put all these people together in a gang, if you like.